Today, we're diving into one of the lesser-known chapters of World War II history. Why did Ireland refuse to fight the Nazis? While much of the world was embroiled in a brutal war against fascism, Ireland chose a different path. But the reasons behind this decision aren't as simple as they might seem. This story is about more than just staying neutral. It's about a young nation finding its identity, its sovereignty, and balancing on a delicate tightrope between survival and principle. First, let's set the scene. It's 1939, World War II is about to erupt and countries across Europe are forced to pick sides. But in Ireland, the government, led by Éamon de Valera, made the decision to remain neutral. In fact, throughout the entire war, Ireland stayed officially out of the conflict. For some, this was seen as cowardice or a failure to join the fight against the horrors of Nazism. But was it really that simple? Let's dig a little deeper into Ireland's past and the reasons behind this controversial decision. At the time, Ireland was still a young, fragile nation. Having only gained independence from Britain in 1922, the scars of colonial rule were still fresh. The Irish Free State had spent years struggling to assert its sovereignty, and any involvement in a British-led war effort could easily be seen as an act of submission to the former colonial power. For many Irish people, especially those who had lived through the Irish War of Independence and the subsequent Civil War, the idea of fighting alongside Britain would have been unthinkable. But there was more to it than just anti-British sentiment. Ireland's neutrality was also a deeply pragmatic choice. As a small, relatively weak nation with a limited military and resources, getting involved in a war on either side could have easily led to disaster. The Irish government understood this well, and de Valera framed neutrality as the best way to protect the Irish people from the horrors of war. De Valera once said, "We are a neutral nation. This is a policy dictated by our history, our geography, and our vital national interests." Ireland's neutrality, known locally as the emergency, was more than just a political stance. It was a statement of sovereignty. By staying out of the war, de Valera was sending a clear message to the world. Ireland was a free, independent nation that would not be dragged into foreign conflicts, particularly one involving its former colonizer. But let's not mistake neutrality for indifference. Ireland's neutrality wasn't isolationism. De Valera and the Irish government had to balance their position carefully to avoid antagonising Britain, while also maintaining diplomatic relations with countries on both sides of the conflict. And despite official neutrality, Ireland's geographical location meant it was deeply entangled in the war's events, both strategically and morally. One of the most controversial aspects of de Valera's leadership was his diplomatic balancing act. While he refused to formally join the war effort, Ireland quietly cooperated with Britain in several ways. For instance, Irish weather reports, which were vital for Allied planning, including the D-Day landings, were shared with the British. Moreover, British and Allied airmen who crash-landed in Ireland were often covertly allowed to return to the UK, while German airmen were interned. Yet, de Valera never wavered in his official stance of neutrality. In the eyes of many, this approach preserved Ireland's fragile sovereignty and kept the country out of direct conflict. But it didn't come without criticism from within Ireland and abroad. To understand why Ireland stayed out of World War II, we must first understand the man who led the country during this crucial period, Éamon de Valera. He was a commandant of Irish volunteers during the 1916 Easter Rising against Britain. He was arrested and sentenced to death, but released for a variety of reasons, including his American citizenship and the public response to the British execution of other Easter Rising leaders. He returned to Ireland after being jailed in England and became one of the leading political figures of the War of Independence. After the signing of the Anglo-Irish Treaty, de Valera became a major political leader. By the time the war broke out in 1939, de Valera had been a dominant figure in Irish politics for over 2 decades. He had played a key role in the Irish War of Independence and later, in the aftermath of the Anglo-Irish Treaty, led the faction that opposed the treaty, sparking the Irish Civil War. After emerging as the leader of Fianna Fáil and becoming Taoiseach, his central goal was always the protection and consolidation of Irish sovereignty. Ireland had only become a fully independent state in 1937, after the adoption of a new constitution. The wounds of colonial rule were still raw, and de Valera's priority was to ensure that Ireland was never again seen as a vassal of Britain. World War II presented a delicate challenge. On the one hand, Britain was fighting against a force as malevolent as Nazi Germany. On the other hand, Ireland had just fought a brutal war to free itself from British control. In de Valera's view, fighting alongside Britain, even against the Nazis, would be seen as a betrayal of everything the Irish independence movement had fought for. It would have been perceived as reverting to subservience under the British Empire. His focus was clear. Ireland must chart its own course, independent of British influence. At the time, de Valera framed neutrality as Ireland's path to survival, saying, "We remain neutral, not because we were indifferent to the fate of Europe, but because we believed it was in the best interests of our people." While Éamon de Valera's government maintained a policy of neutrality during World War II, this decision had far-reaching consequences both at home and abroad. For the Irish people, neutrality was not without its moral dilemmas. The horrors of Nazi Germany were well known across Europe by the early 1940s, and many questioned whether staying out of the war was the right course of action, especially when so many lives were at stake. Let's take a look at the social fabric of Ireland at the time. The country had only recently emerged from years of political unrest and civil war. The wounds of these conflicts were still fresh, and many people, particularly veterans of the Irish War of Independence and Irish Civil War, viewed neutrality as an opportunity to avoid yet another foreign entanglement. After decades of violence and sacrifice for freedom, the last thing many Irish people wanted was to be dragged into another global conflict, especially alongside the British. However, not all Irish citizens were content with the idea of staying out of the war. Around 70,000 Irish volunteers left Ireland to join the British Army and fight against the Axis powers, driven by a sense of duty to fight fascism or by economic hardship that made military service an attractive option. These men fought in some of the most crucial battles of the war, from North Africa to Normandy, despite their homeland's neutral stance. One of the most poignant criticisms of Ireland's neutrality came from Irish intellectuals and writers who questioned whether moral neutrality in the face of evil was really possible. Sean O'Fallon, an influential Irish writer, captured this sentiment when he said, "To be neutral in such a moment is to be morally dead." This quote underscores the moral conflict that many Irish people felt. While the government was adamant about staying out of the war, individuals across Ireland grappled with the larger ethical question: should Ireland have joined the fight against Nazi tyranny, regardless of its delicate political situation? At the same time, neutrality brought about very real economic hardships. Trade was heavily disrupted, and Ireland experienced shortages of essential goods, such as fuel and food. Rationing was introduced, and while Ireland was spared the bombings that devastated cities in Europe and the UK, its people still felt the pinch of a world at war. On the other hand, neutrality also saved countless Irish lives. Ireland's cities, unlike those in London or Belfast, were not targets for Nazi bombings. And yet, neutrality wasn't as simple as staying on the sidelines. On May 31st, 1941, Dublin was bombed by German aircraft in what became known as the North Strand bombing. While the exact reasons for the bombing remain unclear, whether it was a mistake or a message to the Irish government, 28 civilians were killed and 90 were injured. Even neutral Ireland wasn't immune from the destruction of war. Interestingly, despite the bombings and the tensions between Ireland and Britain, Winston Churchill continued to press de Valera to join the war. Churchill, ever the pragmatist, understood the strategic importance of Ireland's geographic position. In his famous VE Day speech in 1945, Churchill said, "I must indeed admit that at times, when we needed the aid of air bases and facilities in the west of Ireland, we could only hope for neutrality from the government of Mr. de Valera." It's clear that Churchill, despite his admiration for Irish soldiers who fought with Britain, was frustrated by Ireland's refusal to fully enter the conflict. But de Valera was unwavering. His goal remained the same: preserve Irish sovereignty, even if it meant taking a controversial stance. He believed that Ireland's survival as an independent nation depended on staying out of the war, and he viewed neutrality as a shield that protected Ireland from becoming a battleground once again. Perhaps the most controversial aspect of Ireland's neutrality came after the war. In 1945, de Valera made the decision to visit the German legation in Dublin to offer condolences on the death of Adolf Hitler. This gesture was widely condemned both in Ireland and internationally. To many, it appeared that de Valera was offering sympathies to one of the most reviled figures in history, at a time when the world was celebrating the fall of Nazism. De Valera, however, justified the visit as a matter of diplomatic protocol. In his mind, offering condolences to the German envoy was a necessary part of maintaining Ireland's policy of neutrality. But to many, the visit remains a stain on de Valera's legacy, and it added fuel to the argument that Ireland had been morally detached from the war's atrocities. In defence of the visit, de Valera famously said, "It is my duty to be consistent in my neutrality." The aftermath of the war brought a mixed reaction in Ireland. Some praised de Valera for keeping the country out of the bloodshed, while others questioned whether neutrality had been the right choice, especially given the scope of the atrocities uncovered in Nazi concentration camps. As we look at the strategic decisions behind Ireland's neutrality during World War II, it becomes clear that Éamon de Valera's choice was not only a matter of preserving sovereignty, but also one of survival. Ireland, a small nation, was in a precarious position between the two warring giants, Nazi Germany and Britain, its former colonial master. De Valera knew that Ireland lacked the military capacity and resources to defend itself in the event of an invasion, so staying neutral was seen as a safeguard against becoming a battleground. But neutrality came with risks of its own. Ireland's geographical position on the western edge of Europe made it strategically important for both the Allies and the Axis powers. The Irish coastline would have been a valuable asset for Britain, and Churchill knew it. Irish ports, such as Cobh and Lough Swilly, could have provided crucial naval bases for the British Royal Navy in the Atlantic, where the fight against German U-boats was fierce. However, de Valera's refusal to allow British forces access to these ports during the war was a sticking point in Anglo-Irish relations. Winston Churchill, who was never shy about expressing his frustrations, made no secret of the fact that he felt Ireland's neutrality was a hindrance to the Allied war effort. In his famous VE Day speech in 1945, Churchill alluded to his grievances with de Valera, stating, "Owing to the action of Mr. de Valera, so much of the war passed by Ireland and the Irish people without a sense of the participation of their own country in the human struggle of the time." However, despite the frustrations of Allied leaders like Churchill, it's important to recognise that Ireland's neutrality also served as a buffer. De Valera was concerned that if Ireland entered the war on the side of the Allies, it might provoke a German invasion. While Britain was a seasoned and well-armed combatant, Ireland had only a small, poorly equipped military. De Valera, aware of this vulnerability, believed that neutrality would help Ireland avoid being dragged into the chaos that engulfed much of Europe. The reality was that while Nazi Germany was unlikely to invade Ireland, the fear of German forces landing on Irish soil was not unfounded. German intelligence had drawn up plans for an invasion of Ireland known as Operation Green, which would have been part of a larger invasion of Britain. Though the plan was never executed, it contributed to the atmosphere of anxiety within the Irish government. Despite staying out of direct conflict, Ireland's neutrality wasn't entirely passive. De Valera walked a delicate tightrope, covertly offering assistance to the Allies in various ways. For instance, Ireland allowed Allied airmen who crash-landed in the country to return to Britain, while German airmen were interned. Additionally, Irish weather reports were secretly shared with the British, playing a critical role in the planning of major Allied operations, including the D-Day landings in 1944. But there were costs to Ireland's neutrality, particularly in terms of its relationship with the international community. After the war, Ireland was viewed with suspicion by many Western nations. Its refusal to join the fight against Nazi Germany and the controversial visit de Valera made to the German legation upon Hitler's death left a stain on its reputation. Many countries saw Ireland as being out of step with the broader moral consensus that had emerged after the horrors of the Holocaust were revealed. One of the more immediate consequences of this was Ireland's exclusion from the newly formed United Nations in 1945. The UN, an organisation built on the ashes of the League of Nations, was seen as the new global platform for peace, diplomacy and human rights. Ireland, despite its desire to join, was not admitted until 1955, 10 years after the war had ended. The perception that Ireland had been morally disengaged from the global fight against fascism made its road to international reintegration a difficult one. Winston Churchill himself blocked Ireland's entry to the UN, citing its neutrality during the war. This diplomatic snub further strained relations between Ireland and Britain, and though Ireland eventually joined the UN, the impact of its wartime stance lingered in its foreign policy for years to come. However, despite these challenges, Ireland's neutrality left a lasting legacy of independence in the Irish psyche. For many Irish citizens, de Valera's refusal to join the war effort symbolised Ireland's right to self-determination. By staying out of the war, de Valera had proven that Ireland would not be bullied or coerced by either Britain or Germany. The fact that Ireland survived the war, largely unscathed while much of Europe lay in ruins, was seen by some as vindication of de Valera's policies. Even today, the debate around Ireland's neutrality during World War II remains contentious. Was de Valera's decision one of pragmatism, protecting Ireland from unnecessary suffering and maintaining its sovereignty? Or was it a moral failure, a refusal to stand up against the evils of Nazism? The answer, as is often the case in history, is not straightforward. While we can look back and judge the actions of past leaders, it's important to remember the context in which those decisions were made. Ireland, barely a generation removed from its own war of independence, was a young and fragile nation. De Valera's priority was to protect that nation from being drawn into another conflict that could have easily devastated it. Today, as we reflect on the complexities of war, neutrality and sovereignty, Ireland's experience during World War II offers a valuable lesson. It shows us the difficult choices that leaders must make in times of crisis and how those choices can shape a nation's future, sometimes in ways that are still felt decades later. As we wrap up this complex story of Ireland's neutrality during World War II, it's clear that Éamon de Valera's decision to keep Ireland out of the war was driven by a combination of pragmatism, survival, and a desire to assert Irish sovereignty. This wasn't a decision made lightly, and its consequences, both immediate and long-term, have shaped Ireland's identity on the global stage. At the heart of Ireland's neutrality is the question of moral responsibility versus national self-interest. Should a small, newly independent country be expected to join a fight that could jeopardize its fragile statehood? Or should it stand alongside others in opposing a force as dark as Nazi Germany, even if it risks becoming a battleground? These are the questions that have lingered long after the war ended, and they remain relevant in modern discussions about neutrality and international intervention. Let's look at the key takeaways from Ireland's wartime experience. First, neutrality was a strategic necessity. For de Valera and much of the Irish government, neutrality was essential to preserving the sovereignty Ireland had so painfully won. The country had only recently emerged from decades of conflict. First, the War of Independence against Britain, then the bitter civil war that followed the signing of the Anglo-Irish Treaty. By keeping Ireland out of the war, de Valera sought to protect the nation from being dragged into a conflict that could tear it apart once again. Second, survival was paramount. For a small, underdeveloped country with a limited military, entering the war would have exposed Ireland to immense risks. The possibility of German invasion loomed large, and without the military or resources to defend itself, Ireland would likely have been overrun. As we saw with the bombing of Dublin's North Strand, even neutral countries weren't entirely safe from the effects of the war. Third, neutrality came with moral compromises. While many Irish citizens supported neutrality, others, including the 70,000 Irish volunteers who joined the British forces, felt a moral obligation to fight against fascism. The global conflict against Nazism raised questions about whether neutrality in the face of such atrocities was justifiable. Sean O'Fallon's quote, "To be neutral in such a moment is to be morally dead," reflects the inner conflict that many in Ireland felt during the war. Fourth, Ireland faced international consequences for its neutrality. While it may have kept the country safe from immediate harm, it created diplomatic challenges in the post-war world. Ireland's exclusion from the United Nations for a decade and the criticism it received from world leaders like Winston Churchill show how its stance was viewed with suspicion by other nations. It took years for Ireland to re-establish itself on the global stage. Finally, neutrality left a legacy of sovereignty. In the long run, Ireland's wartime neutrality has been seen by many as a successful assertion of the country's independence from British influence. De Valera's unwavering stance, controversial as it may have been, cemented Ireland's right to chart its own course, free from external pressures. The fact that Ireland emerged from the war relatively unscathed, while much of Europe lay in ruins, reinforced this sentiment. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Ireland's neutrality during WWII. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel for more insightful content on historical events.